The first time Margaret Harmon saw a bullet fail, she was 12 years old. Her father had taken her to the Army Proving Grounds outside Hartford, where a crew of soldiers fired a water-cooled .30 caliber machine gun at a steel plate bolted to a wooden frame. The bullet struck the plate and flattened against it like coins thrown at a wall. The soldiers cheered because the gun had functioned perfectly. Edward Harmon did not cheer. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and stared at the unmarked plate and said nothing for a long time. On the drive home, Maggie asked him what was wrong. The gun had worked. Everyone was happy. The gun worked, he said. The bullet didn't. There's a difference. That was 1910. The world had not yet learned what machine guns could do to men standing in trenches or what armored steel could do to machine gun bullets. But Edward Harmon already understood with the quiet certainty of an engineer who spent his life studying the relationship between force and resistance that the weapons he was building would someday meet a problem they could not solve, a target they could not penetrate, an enemy they could not reach. He was right. It took 7 years and 4 million dead for the rest of the world to catch up. The First World War turned the machine gun from a battlefield novelty into the defining instrument of industrial killing. Every major army deployed them in enormous numbers. They fired the same cartridges as standard infantry rifles, the American .30-06, the British .303, the German 8mm Mauser. And against unprotected men crossing open ground, they were devastating beyond anything the generals who ordered those crossings had imagined. But the war did not stand still. Armored plating began appearing on aircraft. Tanks crawled onto the battlefield for the first time. Slow, unreliable, terrifying machines that shrugged off rifle-caliber bullets the way a man shrugs off rain. The machine guns that could stop a 1,000-man infantry charge in 60 seconds were helpless against a steel box on treads. Edward Harmon followed these developments from his workshop in Connecticut, where he designed weapons for the United States Army under contract. He was not a soldier. He had never fired a weapon in anger. He was a mechanic's son from Utah who had taught himself engineering through correspondence courses and an obsessive, almost pathological attention to how things fit together and why they sometimes didn't. By 1917, he had already designed several weapons that the Army considered among the finest in their inventory, including the M1917 water-cooled machine gun, a .30 caliber weapon with a reputation for reliability so thorough that soldiers who used it spoke of it, the way sailors speak of ships that have carried them through storms. In the autumn of that year, the Army sent Edward Harmon a request that would define the rest of his life, and though neither of them knew it yet, the rest of his daughter's life as well. The specifications were straightforward in their ambition and staggering in their technical demands. The Army wanted a new weapon that could reliably destroy tanks and aircraft, but also remain effective against conventional targets, infantry fortification supply lines. The caliber had to be at least half an inch. The muzzle velocity had to exceed 2,700 feet per second. Nothing in the American arsenal came close to meeting these requirements. Nothing in any army's arsenal did. The request came with a crate. Inside the crate, packed in straw, was a single cartridge, a German 30. 2mm anti-tank rifle round captured on the Western Front and shipped across the Atlantic for Harmon's examination. He held it up to the light in his workshop, while Maggie, now 19, watched from her drafting table in the corner, where she had been sketching feed mechanism designs since she was 15. The German round was enormous compared to the .30-06 cartridges scattered across Edward's workbench. It was thick, heavy, purposeful. The Germans had designed it to penetrate the armor of Allied tanks, and by all reports it worked. "Look at this," Edward said, turning the cartridge slowly between his fingers. "They made exactly what we need. They just didn't know what to do with it." The Germans had built a single-shot anti-tank rifle around the 13.2mm cartridge, essentially a scaled-up infantry rifle, cumbersome and slow. They had envisioned mounting the round in a machine gun, but they never did it. The idea stayed on paper. The cartridge remained a curiosity, a solution waiting for a problem that its creators could not quite articulate. Edward Harmon articulated it in 3 weeks. He would take his proven M1917 design and scale the entire mechanism up to handle a cartridge, inspired by the German round but redesigned to American specifications. The result would be a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon that existed nowhere in the world, in any army for any purpose. He started drawing that night. Maggie, who had inherited her father's inability to stop working once an idea had taken hold, stayed up with him until dawn calculating feed angles and recoil spring tensions while he sketched receiver dimensions on butcher paper taped to the workshop wall. The cartridge he designed, the .50 BMG 12.7 by 99 mm, was a scaled-up .30-06 incorporating the ballistic lessons of the German round. It would deliver between 10,000 and 15,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. That was roughly 4 times what the .30-06 produced. Compared to the 8 mm Mauser that every German machine gun fired, it carried 5 to 10 times more energy. At 100 yards, it could penetrate approximately 1 inch of hardened steel armor plate. It was on paper exactly what the army had asked for. The problem was turning paper into steel. The first prototype was ready for testing exactly 1 week after the armistice that ended the First World War. The timing was cruel. The weapon that had been conceived to win a war arrived the moment the war ended, and with it the urgency that had funded its development. The trials were a disaster. The prototype jammed repeatedly. The recoil was so violent that no gunner could maintain accurate fire for more than a few seconds. The barrel overheated within minutes of sustained firing. The weapon functioned in the strictest mechanical sense rounds went downrange, but it functioned the way a horse with a broken leg functions. Technically alive, practically useless. Edward Harmon did not panic. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who stared at problems until he understood them, and then he fixed them. He spent the next 2 years refining the design testing variations and slowly beating the prototype into something that approached reliability. The result was the M1921, a water-cooled heavy machine gun aimed primarily at the anti-aircraft role. It worked. It also weighed approximately 120 pounds when the water jacket was filled. The air-cooled variant was 84 pounds, but its barrel overheated so quickly that sustained fire was measured in seconds rather than minutes. With a 44-pound tripod, the total ground setup weighed between 130 and 170 pounds before a single round of ammunition was counted. And .50 BMG ammunition was not light. The infantry could not realistically operate with this weapon. They could not carry it. They could not set it up quickly enough to respond to a changing tactical situation. They could not keep it firing long enough to be useful. Aircraft of the period could not carry it because of the weight. Early armored vehicles and tanks could not fit it because the ammunition fed only from the left side, making mounting positions severely limited. For several years, the M1921's only practical application was fixed coastal anti-aircraft defense, bolted to a concrete platform pointed at the sky waiting for enemy planes that never came because the war was over. The Army's enthusiasm, already tepid, began to cool. The funding slowed. The project that had been born from the urgent demands of global warfare started to look like an expensive dead end. Edward Harmon kept working. He was 61 years old. His hands shook slightly when he was tired, which was most of the time now. Maggie, 28, had taken over most of the detailed drafting work, translating her father's concepts into precise technical drawings with a steadiness of hand that he envied, and a mechanical intuition that he recognized as his own reflected back through younger eyes. They worked together through the winter of 1925 and into the spring of 1926, trying to solve the overheating problem that had plagued every air-cooled variant. Edward believed the answer lay in barrel mass. A heavier barrel that could absorb more heat before reaching critical temperature. But he could not find the right balance between weight-heat dissipation and manufacturing feasibility. Every solution created a new problem. Every fix broke something else. On a Tuesday morning in November 1926, Edward Harmon sat down at his workbench, picked up a barrel assembly he had been measuring the night before, and set it down again without looking at it. He told Maggie he was going to lie down for a few minutes. He walked to the small cot in the back of the workshop, where he sometimes napped during long working sessions. He did not wake up. The funeral was small. Edward Harmon had not been a famous man. He was known within the Army Ordnance Department and among a small circle of weapons engineers, but the general public had never heard his name and never would. The newspapers did not cover his death. The Army sent a representative, a colonel named Braddock Llewellyn, who had overseen the M1921 trials and the subsequent years of frustration, who stood at the back of the church and left before the reception. 3 days after the funeral, Llewellyn came to the workshop. He was there to discuss the disposition of Edward Harmon's unfinished projects, his notes and his contractual obligations to the Army. He expected to have this conversation with Edward's attorney, or perhaps a business partner. He found Maggie at the drafting table working. The conversation that followed was short and for Maggie defining. Llewellyn explained that the Army appreciated Edward Harmon's contributions and would honor the remaining terms of his contract. However, the .50 caliber project was at a crossroads, and the Army needed to decide whether to continue development with a new lead engineer. A qualified engineer, he said with the particular emphasis that men of his generation placed on that word when they meant something specific about the person they were speaking to, or to shelve the project indefinitely. He suggested, with what he clearly believed was kindness, that Maggie sell her father's patents, collect the royalties from his existing designs, and pursue a life more suited to her circumstances. Maggie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Have you read his notes?" Llewellyn had not. "Then you don't know what this weapon is yet," she said. "Neither does anyone else, except me." Llewellyn left. He did not take the patents with him. Over the next several weeks, he attempted to assign the project to 3 different engineers within Army Ordnance, all of whom declined after reviewing the technical challenges involved. The .50 caliber project was considered a career graveyard, an expensive, overambitious program attached to a dead man's name, championed by his daughter, producing a weapon that nobody knew how to use. Maggie did not wait for the Army to decide her future. She had spent the last decade working alongside her father on every aspect of the M1921's design. She understood its strengths because she had helped build them. She understood its flaws because she had documented them in notebooks that filled an entire shelf in the workshop, written in a handwriting that grew steadily more precise as the years passed. And the girl who had started sketching feed mechanisms at 15 became the engineer who could calculate recoil impulse and chamber pressure in her head. She also understood something that none of the Army engineers understood, because none of them had spent 10 years watching Edward Harmon fail. Her father had been trying to build one perfect weapon. That was the wrong approach. The weapon did not need to be perfect in one configuration. It needed to be adaptable across many. The first breakthrough was the universal receiver. Instead of designing separate weapons for each application, anti-aircraft ground combat vehicle mount aircraft installation, Maggie designed a single receiver that could be configured into 7 different types of .50 caliber machine gun simply by changing the barrel jacket and mounting components. The same core mechanism could accept a water-cooled barrel with its jacket for sustained naval fire, a heavy air-cooled barrel for ground use, or a lighter air-cooled barrel for aircraft. The same receiver could feed ammunition from either the right or the left side, which meant it could be mounted in any position on any platform with minimal modification. It was an elegant solution, and it was a solution that could only have come from someone who stood slightly outside the established engineering culture. Edward Harmon's colleagues had spent years trying to optimize each individual variant. Maggie, who had been excluded from their meetings and their professional conversations, who had worked alone at her drafting table while the men discussed the weapons problems in rooms she was not invited to enter, had the advantage of seeing the whole problem at once. She did not see 7 weapons that each needed to be made better. She saw one weapon that needed to be made flexible. The second breakthrough solved the overheating problem that had defeated her father. Edward had been right that the answer lay in barrel mass, but he had been searching for a precise balance that did not exist, a barrel heavy enough to absorb sustained fire, but light enough for practical use. Maggie abandoned the search for balance and chose mass. She specified a heavy barrel significantly heavier than any previous variant and accepted the weight penalty. The weapon would be heavier than her father had wanted. It would also work. The result was the M2HB, the M2 heavy barrel, 84 pounds, a cyclic rate of fire between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, an effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. It operated on the short recoil principle. When a round fired the barrel and bolt traveled rearward together, locked, keeping the cartridge case fully supported while chamber pressure peaked. After approximately 10 millimeters of travel, the barrel stopped while the bolt continued rearward alone, extracting and ejecting the spent case. The recoil spring then drove the bolt forward, stripping a new round from the disintegrating link belt, chambering it and firing. The cycle repeated as long as the trigger was held. It was not complicated in concept. Doing it reliably at scale with a round as powerful as the .50 BMG was the engineering challenge that had consumed Edward Harmon's last years and Margaret Harmon's first years as a solo designer. Between father and daughter, getting everything to work right had taken the better part of 2 decades. But by 1933 it worked. The M2HB was in limited production. The Army had accepted it into service. And then almost nothing happened. Before 1933, there were just 990 M2 machine guns in the entire American military inventory. After 1933, the number grew but slowly. The .30 caliber machine gun remained the workhorse. The M2 was classified for experimental use, only a bureaucratic designation that meant it could be tested but not relied upon. No one knew what to do with a weapon this powerful, that was also this heavy, this expensive, and this hungry for ammunition that cost 10 times what standard rounds cost. Maggie continued refining the design from her workshop, submitting reports to an army that read them politely and filed them in cabinets that were rarely opened. She flagged potential improvements. She identified manufacturing inefficiencies. She documented one particular concern repeatedly, in report after report, with the methodical persistence of someone who knew she was right and also knew that no one was listening. The concern was headspace and timing. The manufacturing technology of the 1920s could not hold tight enough tolerances to precisely control the distance between the bolt face and the base of the cartridge case when seated in the chamber, or the exact moment the firing pin fell relative to the bolt's position in its recoil cycle. Both had to be exactly right. Too tight and the round would not chamber. Too loose and the cartridge case could rupture inside the chamber, an internal explosion that sent brass shrapnel into the gunner's face and hands. Edward Harmon's solution had been to make both measurements adjustable by the operator, using a specialized gauge and a careful sequence of clicks. It solved the manufacturing problem by transferring the precision requirement to the soldier in the field. It was a pragmatic compromise. It was also, Maggie believed, a time bomb. She wrote this in her reports. She used more diplomatic language, but the meaning was clear. The headspace and timing adjustment procedure was too complex, too dependent on training and conditions, and too likely to be performed incorrectly under stress. Someday it would fail. Someday someone would skip the procedure or rush through it and the weapon would hurt them. The Army's response was consistent across every report. The weapon functioned as designed. The training was adequate. The problem was theoretical. And in 1937, as Germany rearmed and the world began its slow slide toward another war, the experimental use restriction on the M2 was lifted. The Army had bigger problems than theoretical flaws in a weapon that worked. When Germany invaded France, American Ordnance issued contracts worth over $60 million to produce the M2 across 4 types. The weapon that had been an expensive curiosity for 20 years was about to become the most produced heavy machine gun in history. Maggie Harmon read the contract specifications at her drafting table and felt something she had not felt since her father died, the absolute certainty that everything was about to change. She was right. She just did not know yet how much. The telegram arrived at the Harmon workshop on a Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. Maggie was alone at her drafting table, surrounded by blueprints she had been refining for months. Minor adjustments to feed mechanisms, small tolerances that nobody in the Army seemed to care about anymore. The M2 had been in limited service for nearly a decade, and the military establishment treated it the way one might treat an old piece of furniture, acknowledged but largely ignored. She heard the delivery boy's bicycle bell before the knock came. The message was short. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The Pacific Fleet was burning. Maggie set the telegram down on her work table next to the barrel assembly she had been measuring with calipers that morning. For 15 years she had fought to prove that her father's weapon, her weapon now, was more than a fixed anti-aircraft curiosity. For 15 years, generals and procurement officers had smiled politely and told her that the 990 M2 machine guns currently in service were quite sufficient for peacetime needs. Now peacetime was over. The first reports from Pearl Harbor told the story she had always known the M2 could write. When Japanese Zeros swept low over Battleship Row, it was the M2 Brownings mounted on the ship's decks that formed the last ring of defense. Sailors who managed to reach their stations through fire and flooding turned those heavy barrels skyward and filled the air with half-inch steel. Not every plane went down, but enough did. Enough to prove that in the most desperate moment in American naval history, it was Edward Harmon's unfinished weapon, finished by his daughter, that stood between the fleet and complete annihilation. Within 48 hours, the War Department placed the largest weapons contract in American history. Over $60 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, went to factories across the country to produce the M2 in 4 configurations: the heavy barrel ground version, the water-cooled naval variant, the aircraft model, and a new flexible mount for vehicles. The order called for hundreds of thousands of units. Maggie read the production specifications in her workshop and noticed something that made her set the paper down and close her eyes for a long moment. The Army wanted nearly 2 million of them. 2 million copies of the machine her father had dreamed up in a workshop, not unlike this one working from a captured German cartridge, and the stubborn belief that bigger was better. She picked up the framed photograph of Edward Harmon that sat on her shelf, a formal portrait, the only one he had ever agreed to sit for. "You should see this, Papa," she thought. "They finally believe us." Production began at a pace that would have seemed impossible even a year earlier. Factories that had been making automobile parts and farm equipment retooled their lines almost overnight. Women who had never seen the inside of a machine shop learned to mill receivers and test headspace gauges. The irony was not lost on Maggie, the weapon that the military establishment had refused to take seriously when a woman championed it was now being built largely by women's hands. The M2 went everywhere. It went to North Africa with the 1st American Divisions to see combat against Rommel's Afrika Korps. It went to the Pacific on every landing craft that hit a beach. It went into the skies, bolted to the wings and turrets of every fighter and bomber the Army Air Forces could produce. And it was in the air that the M2 first revealed the full extent of what it could do. The aircraft version, designated AN/M2, was a fundamentally different creature from the ground weapon Maggie had spent years perfecting. Where the ground M2HB fired at a measured 450 to 575 rounds per minute, the aircraft variant screamed at over 850, with some tuned versions reaching 1,200 rounds per minute. That rate of fire approached the legendary German MG42, but with a round that carried 5 to 10 times the energy of the German 8mm Mauser cartridge. The engineering reason was elegant at 30,000 feet, flying at several hundred miles per hour. The freezing slipstream handled the cooling problem that had plagued the ground version for 2 decades. The barrel that would have glowed cherry red after sustained fire on the ground stayed cold enough in the sky to sustain that murderous rate of fire indefinitely. But the tactical reason was even simpler. When an enemy fighter crossed your gun sight at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour, you had perhaps 2 seconds to fire. In those 2 seconds, you needed as many rounds in the air as physically possible. Every additional round was another chance to hit. Every miss meant the target was gone, possibly forever, possibly circling back to kill you. The numbers became staggering. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 M2 Brownings in its wings, 8 barrels converging on a single point in space, pouring out nearly 7,000 rounds per minute combined. The P-51 Mustang carried 6, the F-6F Hellcat 6, the F-4U Corsair 6. Each of these fighters could put more lead into the air in a 3-second burst than an entire infantry platoon firing for a full minute. But the Douglas A-26 Invader took the concept to what some engineers privately called an obscene extreme. It carried up to 18 M2 Brownings, 8 in the nose, 4 in each wing, and 2 in a dorsal turret. When all 18 guns fired simultaneously at a ground target during a strafing run, the combined effect was less like gunfire and more like a natural disaster. Trees snapped, vehicles disintegrated, stone walls turned to gravel. Then there was the B-17 Flying Fortress, which carried up to 13 M2 Brownings in various turrets and waist positions. The B-17 was not designed to attack, it was designed to survive. Those 13 guns formed a sphere of defensive fire meant to keep German fighters from getting close enough to deliver a killing blow. A formation of 36 B-17s could put nearly 500 heavy machine guns into the air simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the surrounding sky into a killing zone. Some German fighters carried 20 and 30 millimeter autocannons that packed more punch per round than the .50 BMG. But the American approach compensated with volume. The M2's higher rate of fire and the sheer number of guns on each aircraft meant more rounds in the air per second. And the .50 BMG round was more than sufficient to destroy any aircraft of the period it could punch through. An engine block shatter, a propeller hub, or penetrate the armored plate behind a pilot's seat. Against ground targets during strafing runs, the concentrated fire from 6 or 8 wing-mounted M2s worked against hardened targets. 2 locomotives, armored vehicles, supply trucks, and even light tanks could be disabled or destroyed by sustained fire from above. Maggie received weekly production reports at her workshop, where she continued refining designs and consulting with the Army on manufacturing tolerances. The numbers were abstract at first. Then the combat reports started arriving. Reports that described what the .50 BMG actually did to aircraft, to vehicles, to the human body. Reports she read in full because she believed she owed that much to the people on both ends of her father's creation. The M45 quadruple mount was not Maggie's design. It was an Army ordnance project that took 4 M22 Brownings and mounted them on an electrically powered turret that could traverse 360 degrees and elevate from -10 to +90 degrees. The purpose was anti-aircraft defense against low-flying attack planes, a role the M2 had filled since Pearl Harbor. But something happened in the European theater that no one had anticipated, least of all the weapons creators. By late 1944, the German Luftwaffe had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force over Western Europe. Allied air superiority was so complete that the Quad 50 crews, the men who sat behind 4 heavy machine guns all day waiting for enemy planes that rarely came, found themselves with an enormous amount of firepower and nothing in the sky to use it on. So they pointed the guns downward. The first reports of the Quad 50 being used against ground targets filtered back to the United States through after-action reviews that read more like horror fiction than military documents. 4 M2 Brownings firing simultaneously produced roughly 2,000 rounds per minute of .50 BMG, a continuous stream of half-inch steel that could traverse across a position in seconds. The German soldiers who survived encounters with what they called the Fleischwolf, the meat grinder, described it as facing something that was no longer a weapon in any conventional sense. It was closer to an industrial process, something mechanical and absolute that reduced everything in its path to its component materials. American troops had their own names for it: the meat chopper, the kraut mower, names that carried a dark humor born from the relief of having that particular piece of machinery on their side, rather than the enemy's. When Maggie read those reports, she set them down on the table where her father had first sketched the scaled-up receiver in 1917. She looked at his portrait on the wall. He had designed a weapon to stop tanks and aircraft machines made of steel and fuel. He had never imagined the Quad 50. He had never imagined the meat chopper. What have we made, Papa? She thought. But she already knew the answer. They had made a weapon that was very, very good at its job. And war had a way of finding new jobs for good weapons. The greatest irony of the M2's dominance was one that Maggie understood better than anyone alive because she had grown up hearing the story from her father. The entire .50 BMG cartridge. The round that was now tearing the German military apart from North Africa to Normandy had been inspired by a German creation, the 13 2mm anti-tank rifle round that Edward Harmon had examined in 1917. The one the Germans had designed to penetrate Allied tanks had provided the exact specifications that the American round needed to meet. The Germans had created the blueprint. They had built the prototype cartridge. They had even envisioned mounting it in a machine gun, though they never actually did it. Now, 27 years later, their own idea was coming back to destroy them, in a form they could not match and could not counter. The German military had no equivalent to the M2 Browning in ground service. Their primary machine gun, the MG-42, widely regarded as the finest general-purpose machine gun ever made, fired the 8mm Mauser cartridge. The same round from the First War, the same round from their infantry rifles. It was excellent against personnel. It was largely useless against the armored vehicles and aircraft that now dominated every battlefield. The MG-42's legendary rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, was higher than the ground M2's 500. But rate of fire meant nothing when your round bounced off the target's armor like a pebble off a windshield. The .50 BMG delivered 5 to 10 times the energy of the 8mm Mauser. At 100 yards, it could penetrate nearly an inch of hardened steel armor plate. It could punch through the side armor of a Panzer IV. It could destroy a locomotive. It could reduce a stone wall to rubble if you put enough rounds into the same spot. German intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that Wehrmacht commanders had repeatedly requested a heavy machine gun comparable to the American M2. The requests were denied every time. Germany's war industry already stretched beyond capacity. Producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for existing weapons could not afford to develop an entirely new weapon system, a new cartridge in the manufacturing infrastructure to produce both in meaningful numbers. There was a bitter footnote. German naval intelligence had actually drawn up plans to use captured M2 Brownings for the defense of their U-boat pens and had even begun attempting to manufacture .50 BMG ammunition in small quantities. The effort never produced results in any significant numbers. The nation that had created the cartridge concept could not even copy the weapon it had inspired. The ammunition itself was engineered for versatility that matched the weapon's ubiquity. Standard ball rounds, copper jacket, lead core were devastating enough against unprotected targets. But the belt typically mixed in armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel or tungsten cores marked with black tips capable of punching through vehicle armor. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds added a chemical compound that ignited anything flammable on the other side of the armor. And armor-piercing incendiary tracer rounds combined all three functions while leaving a visible trail so the gunner could see exactly where the fire was landing and adjust. The standard combat load mixed these rounds in a carefully calculated pattern. Every fifth round was typically an armor-piercing incendiary tracer, with standard ball or armor-piercing rounds filling the spaces between. A single burst from an M2 therefore delivered multiple types of destruction, simultaneously penetration ignition, and targeting data all in the same trigger pool. And every American vehicle had at least one of these guns. Every half-track, every tank, every armored car, every landing craft, and even jeeps. Every convoy, every forward position, every beach landing. Nearly 2 million M2 Brownings were produced during the war years alone. The weapon that had started with 990 units in service before Pearl Harbor now outnumbered the soldiers of several entire armies. On the Sherman tanks, the M2 occupied a peculiar position literally and tactically. It was mounted on the back of the turret, accessible only to a soldier, who climbed up and stood on the engine deck, fully exposed from the waist up to everything the battlefield could throw at him. It was the most dangerous position on the most prominent vehicle in any American armored column. The M2 gunner stood higher than everyone else, visible from every direction, protected by nothing but the steel receiver of the weapon itself. And yet, there was never a shortage of volunteers, because the man behind the M2 was also the most powerful individual soldier on that battlefield. He could traverse the heavy barrel across a tree line in seconds, putting rounds through walls, through vehicles, through anything that the main gun was too slow or too valuable to engage. American tankers developed a technique they called reconnaissance by fire. Approaching a village or a suspicious tree line, the tank commander would not waste a precious main gun shell to determine if the enemy was present. Instead, the M2 gunner would fire a short burst into the position. If someone was hiding there, they would either return fire revealing themselves, or the burst would solve the problem before anyone had to find out the hard way. It was a brutal calculus, but it was efficient, and it was made possible by the seemingly inexhaustible supply of .50 BMG ammunition that American logistics could deliver to every front in quantities that would have seemed obscene to any other army in the war. In the Pacific, the M2 faced a different kind of war. The Japanese military had invested heavily in infantry tactics, offensive spirit, and light armor designed for the jungles and islands of Southeast Asia. Their tanks, the Type 95 Hago and the Type 97 Chiha, were smaller, thinner-skinned, and more lightly armed than their German counterparts. Against European anti-tank weapons, they might have posed a reasonable challenge. Against the M2 Browning, they were coffins on tracks. During banzai charges, the massed infantry assaults that became the defining horror of the Pacific War, Japanese tanks sometimes led the advance, rolling forward through the darkness with infantry behind them. American .50 caliber gunners discovered that they could penetrate the side and rear armor of these tanks at combat ranges with sustained bursts. The armor-piercing rounds punched through the thin steel plate. The incendiary rounds set the fuel and ammunition inside ablaze. The tanks stopped burned, and the infantry behind them ran into a wall of fire that did not relent until the ammunition ran out, or there was nothing left standing. The .50 BMG also filled a gap that no other weapon could occupy. It was too powerful for a rifle and not quite a cannon. It sat in the space between artillery and small arms, and in that space it was absolutely without peer. A well-positioned M2 on a tripod firing from a prepared position with a clear field of view could suppress an entire company at over 2,000 yards. At that distance, the enemy's own machine guns were firing at extreme range, their rounds losing energy and accuracy. The M2's rounds were still arriving with enough force to penetrate any cover short of reinforced concrete. And that brought up the question that the combat surgeons had been documenting since North Africa, the question of what the .50 BMG round actually did to the human body. The medical reports were clinical in their language. and devastating in their content. The standard threshold for high-energy tissue destruction was a projectile velocity of roughly 2,000 feet per second. The .50 BMG left the barrel at approximately 2,900 feet per second, nearly 50% above that threshold. The round was half an inch in diameter. When it struck tissue, it created a wound channel proportional to its size and velocity. But the wound channel was only the beginning. The hydraulic shock effect, the violent outward compression of tissue as the round passed through, followed by the equally violent collapse back inward, destroyed organs that the round had not directly touched. A hit to a limb near a major bone or blood vessel was not survivable without immediate surgical intervention, and even then the limb was almost certainly lost. A hit to the torso was, in the restrained language of the medical reports, incompatible with continued biological function. Maggie read those reports too, every one of them. She believed she had an obligation to understand the full consequences of what she and her father had built. Some nights alone in the workshop after the factory consultations and the production meetings, she wondered whether Edward Harmon had ever imagined this particular dimension of his creation. He had been an engineer. He had thought in terms of muzzle energy and penetration tables and feed mechanisms. She doubted he had spent much time thinking about hydraulic shock effects on human tissue. But she thought about it. She thought about it, and she kept working because the alternative, stopping, meant leaving the weapon in the hands of people who understood it less than she did, and that she had decided would be worse. Colonel Braddock Llewellyn had retired from active service in 1943, his health broken by 30 years of military life and the stress of watching a world war unfold from behind a desk when younger men went to fight. He had followed the M2's combat record through official channels and old connections, watching with a mix of professional satisfaction and private shame as the weapon he had once dismissed proved itself on every front. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe ground toward its inevitable conclusion, he sat at his desk in his home in Virginia and wrote a letter to Maggie Harmon. He wrote it by hand on personal stationery because this was not an official communication. It was something more difficult than that. Dear Miss Harmon, I owe you an apology that is long overdue. When your father died and you took up his work, I told you to sell the patents and go home. I told you that a woman had no place in weapons development. I was wrong on both counts, and the men who are alive today because of your weapon would tell you the same if they knew your name. The M2 Browning has done more to win this war than any single weapon in our arsenal, and perhaps more than most people will ever understand. It has been the one American answer to every problem this war has presented. The aircraft, we could not reach the armor. We could not penetrate the positions we could not break. Your father conceived it. You completed it. The nation owes you a debt it does not yet know how to name. I remain with sincere respect and regret. Braddock Llewellyn, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. Maggie read the letter at her drafting table, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer next to her father's original sketches. She did not cry. She had not cried since the day Edward Harmon died. But she sat very still for a long time, looking at the M2 receiver that sat on her bench. The same receiver design she had finalized 19 years earlier. Now unchanged and seemingly unchangeable, stamped into steel in factories across the country 2 million times over. The weapon was perfect, or as close to perfect as any machine of war could be. But Maggie knew something that Llewellyn and the generals and the factory workers did not know yet. She knew that inside every M2 ever made there was a flaw, a small one, a compromise her father had been forced to accept because the manufacturing technology of 1920 could not hold the tolerances he needed, a flaw she had inherited and could not fix with the tools available to her. The headspace and timing problem, the quiet bomb inside the perfect machine. She had written about it in her technical notes. She had flagged it in reports to the army. No one listened because the gun worked. It worked brilliantly. It was winning a war. And nobody wanted to hear about a theoretical flaw in a weapon that was performing beyond every expectation. But Maggie knew. The flaw was there. And someday when the war was over and the urgency faded and the maintenance standards slipped, it would find someone. It would find a young soldier in a place she could not yet imagine, doing a job she could not yet foresee, and it would hurt him. Because that is what flaws do when you leave them long enough. They wait, and then they find someone. She closed the drawer and went back to work. The war ended the way wars do, not with silence, but with a slow quieting. The factories that had stamped out M2 receivers at a rate that would have seemed hallucinatory in 1940 began scaling down. The assembly lines that had employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, who had learned to mill steel and test headspace with a precision that matched any pre-war armorer, started shutting off one by one. The world exhaled. And Margaret Harmon sat alone in her workshop in Connecticut, surrounded by the blueprints and gauges and half-finished prototypes that had defined her life for 2 decades, and waited for someone to tell her what came next. Nobody did. The army did not call. The War Department, soon to be renamed the Department of Defense, sent no letters of commendation. The M2 Browning went to Korea in 1950 in the same configuration it had carried through Normandy, and Iwo Jima, mounted on the same vehicles, fed by the same belted ammunition, operated by the same manual of arms that Maggie had helped write. It performed exactly as it had performed before, with devastating reliability and absolute indifference to the politics of whoever happened to be pulling the trigger. Maggie followed the reports from Korea the way she had followed the reports from Europe and the Pacific. The M2 was still the heaviest automatic weapon available to American infantry. It was still mounted on every tank, every half-track, every truck that could bear its weight. It was still filling the gap between artillery and small arms, reaching out past 2,000 yards to destroy targets that nothing else in the infantry's arsenal could touch. The frozen hills of Korea added a new dimension in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero, where lighter weapons jammed and seized and refused to function. The M2's overbuilt mechanism kept cycling. The same excess mass that had made it too heavy for infantry to carry without a vehicle now served as a thermal reservoir, keeping the steel warm enough to function when everything else froze solid. And it was still, she noted with the grim satisfaction of an engineer who understood her own creation's limitations, carrying the same flaw it had carried since her father first accepted the compromise in 1920. The headspace and timing problem had not killed anyone yet. Or rather, it had not killed anyone in a way that generated a report specific enough to reach her desk. But she knew it was there. She had always known. The letter arrived in the spring of 1967, forwarded through 3 intermediaries, because Maggie Harmon was not someone the Marine Corps kept on any official mailing list. It was from a young officer who had served at a remote outpost in the mountains of eastern Turkey, near the Soviet border, and wanted her to know what one of her weapons had done in the hands of a man named Grayson Caulfield. Caulfield was a Marine sniper, one of the most decorated and feared marksmen in the history of American warfare. He was not a man who thought in terms of engineering specifications or manufacturing tolerances. He was a man who thought in terms of distance, wind elevation, and the precise moment between one heartbeat and the next. He had achieved confirmed kills at ranges that would have been considered fantasy by any conventional standard. And he had done it with weapons designed for the purpose, bolt-action rifles, with precision optics, tuned triggers, and match-grade ammunition. But Caulfield had a problem that no rifle could solve. There were targets beyond the effective range of any sniper rifle in the American inventory. Targets at 2,000 yards, 2,200, 2,500. Distances where even the finest .30 caliber match round lost its energy, its accuracy, and its ability to deliver a lethal blow. Distances where the wind and the curvature of the earth and the simple physics of a projectile decelerating through atmosphere conspired to make precision shooting an act of prayer rather than skill. So Grayson Caulfield did something that no one in the history of warfare had thought to do before. He mounted a telescopic sight on an M2 Browning heavy machine gun. The idea was so absurd that it circled back around to brilliance. The M2 was a crew-served weapon designed to destroy vehicles and aircraft. It weighed 84 pounds without the tripod. Its trigger was designed for sustained automatic fire, not single precise shots. Every element of its construction was optimized for volume, not accuracy. Using it as a sniper rifle was like using a sledgehammer to perform surgery, except that Caulfield was not most people. He understood what the M2's designers, what Maggie's father had built into the weapon without intending to. The heavy barrel designed to resist overheating during sustained fire also provided extraordinary rigidity. Rigidity meant consistency. Consistency meant that when you fired a single round, the barrel did not flex or vibrate the way a lighter weapon's barrel would. The massive receiver, designed to absorb the recoil of hundreds of rounds per minute, also provided a stable platform for a single carefully aimed shot. And the 50 BMG cartridge itself. The round that Edward Harmon had scaled up from a captured German design in 1917 carried enough energy to remain lethal and accurate at distances that would have been meaningless for any smaller round. From a sandbagged position on a hilltop firing single rounds through an improvised scope mount, Grayson Caulfield engaged and killed an enemy combatant at a confirmed distance of 2,500 yards, 1 mile and 420 yards, a distance at which the target would have been invisible to the unaided eye, a distance at which the bullet traveled for nearly 4 seconds before arriving, a distance at which no one had ever made a confirmed kill with any weapon. The record stood for 35 years. Maggie read the letter twice. Then she set it down. The same workshop, the same walls that had witnessed every iteration of the M2, from her father's first sketches to the production blueprints that had built 2 million copies. And she allowed herself something she rarely permitted. She smiled. Not because a man had died at 2,500 yards. Death was not something Maggie Harmon celebrated, no matter how necessary the military establishment considered it. She smiled because Grayson Caulfield had discovered something about the M2 that she had known since she was 28 years old. And standing over her father's drafting table, trying to understand why he had made the receiver so much heavier than it needed to be for simple reliability. He overbuilt it, Papa, she had thought at the time. He made it stronger than it needed to be. Now she understood that her father had not overbuilt it. He had built it exactly right. He had built it with so much margin, so much excess strength and rigidity, that the weapon could be used for purposes he had never imagined. A machine gun that could be a sniper rifle, a weapon of volume that could become a weapon of precision, an instrument of destruction that contained hidden within its oversized bones the potential for surgical accuracy. That was the thing about good engineering. It did not merely solve the problem you designed it for. It solved problems you did not know existed yet. The man who understood this lesson best was someone Maggie never met. Nolan Prewitt was a photographer and part-time gunsmith from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, who had no formal engineering degree and no connection to the military-industrial establishment. What he had was an obsession. Prewitt had read about Caulfield's record shot. He had studied the ballistics of the .50 BMG cartridge, and he had arrived at a conclusion that the entire firearms industry considered ridiculous, that the .50 BMG deserved its own purpose-built precision rifle. Not a machine gun with a scope bolted on as an afterthought, but a proper rifle, a single-shot or semi-automatic weapon designed from the ground up to exploit the cartridge's extraordinary range and energy in a platform light enough for one man to carry. Every manufacturer he approached turned him down. The idea was commercially unviable, they said. There was no market for a .50 caliber rifle. The ammunition was too expensive. The weapon would be too heavy. The recoil would be unmanageable. The military was not interested. Civilian shooters would never buy one. So Prewitt built it himself, in his garage. Using hand tools, a lathe, and the same .50 BMG cartridge that Edward Harmon had designed in 1917, and that Maggie had spent her career perfecting for mass production. He had no investors, no military contract, no institutional support of any kind. He had a garage, a conviction, and the kind of stubbornness that the established firearms industry mistook for delusion. The rifle that emerged from that garage would go on to set multiple world records for long-range precision shooting. It would be adopted by military special operations forces around the world. It would create an entirely new category of weapon, the anti-materiel rifle, and an entirely new tactical doctrine for engaging targets at extreme range. The cartridge that a woman in a Connecticut workshop had refined for a machine gun was now reaching out past 2,000 yards in a weapon that weighed a third as much and could be carried by a single soldier. The M2 Browning had given birth to its own successor. Or more precisely, the cartridge that Edward Harmon had created and Maggie had refined had proven so capable that it outgrew the weapon it was designed for and demanded a new one. The parent had produced a child. The child had produced a grandchild. And the family tree kept growing, branching into applications that neither Edward nor Maggie could have foreseen. Long-range target shooting competitions, explosive ordnance disposal, counter-sniper operations, even disabling vehicles at checkpoints without killing the occupants. The .50 BMG had become its own ecosystem. But families carry more than their strengths forward. They carry their flaws too. The year was 2005. The place was a forward operating base in Anbar province, Iraq. The temperature was 112 degrees in the shade, and there was very little shade. Sergeant Everett Tully was 19 years old, which made him younger than the M2 Browning mounted on the roof of his Humvee by approximately 83 years. Tully had been in country for 4 months. He had qualified on the M2 at Fort Benning, where an instructor who had served in the First Gulf War had walked him through the barrel change procedure with the calm precision of a man who had done it 1,000 times in air-conditioned ranges with no one shooting at him. The procedure required a specialized gauge, a specific sequence of adjustments, and patience. Headspace was the distance between the bolt face and the base of the cartridge case when it was fully seated in the chamber. It had to be exact. Too tight and the round would not chamber. Too loose and the cartridge case could rupture during firing, splitting open inside the chamber and turning the breech into a fragmentation device that sent shrapnel in every direction, including into the face and hands of the gunner. Timing was the precise moment the firing pin fell relative to the position of the recoiling parts in their cycle. It had to synchronize perfectly with the bolt's lockup. If the pin fell too early before the bolt was fully locked, the same catastrophic case rupture could occur. If it fell too late, the weapon would not fire at all. Both measurements required manual adjustment every time the barrel was changed. Edward Harmon had known this was a problem in 1920. The manufacturing technology of the era could not hold the tolerances needed to make headspace and timing permanent features of the barrel assembly. So he had designed the adjustments to be made by the operator, a pragmatic compromise that solved the manufacturing problem by transferring the precision requirement to the soldier in the field. Maggie had inherited this compromise. She had written about it in her technical reports. She had flagged it to Army ordnance repeatedly throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Each time the response was the same: the weapon works, the training is adequate. The problem is theoretical. No one wanted to redesign the most successful heavy machine gun in history to fix a flaw that only manifested when someone skipped a step. But people always skip steps. Especially 19-year-old people, especially at 2 in the morning in the dark in 112 degrees, with tracers cutting through the air above their heads, and someone on the radio screaming that the convoy is moving in 60 seconds with or without you. Tully's barrel had overheated during a sustained engagement earlier that night. Standard procedure was to let it cool, but there was no time. He pulled the hot barrel, burning his hands through the gloves, and reached for the replacement. The specialized gauge was in the toolbox, bolted to the Humvee's floor, which meant climbing down from the turret, opening the box in the dark, finding the gauge, climbing back up, and performing the adjustment while the rest of the convoy waited. He did what every gunner in the same situation had done since World War II. He counted the clicks. The last barrel had been set at 3.5 clicks past hand tight. He screwed the new barrel in, counted to 3.5, and locked it down. He did not use the gauge. He did not check timing. He got back behind the gun and told the driver to move. The convoy rolled out. 20 minutes later, they made contact with an ambush position on the right side of the road. Tully traversed the M2, acquired the muzzle flashes in the darkness, and pressed the butterfly trigger. The first 3 rounds fired normally. The 4th round ruptured. The cartridge case split along its length inside the chamber. The brass shrapnel blew outward through the gap between the barrel and the receiver. The gap that should not have existed if the headspace had been properly set. Fragments struck Tully in the face, the throat, and both hands. He fell backward off the turret into the interior of the Humvee, bleeding from 7 separate wounds, temporarily blinded in his right eye. He survived. He kept his eye, though the vision never fully recovered. He kept all his fingers, though 2 of them never regained full sensation. He received a Purple Heart and a medical discharge at the age of 20. When he returned to his family's home in West Virginia, he did not blame the weapon. He blamed himself. He had skipped the procedure. He had counted clicks instead of using the gauge. The after-action report agreed with his self-assessment. The report attributed the incident to operator error, failure to follow proper barrel change procedures. The M2 Browning functioned as designed. The fault lay with the soldier, not the weapon. That was the official conclusion. It had been the official conclusion every time this happened in the Second World War in Korea, in the deserts and mountains of the Middle East. Every ruptured case, every face full of brass shrapnel, every burned hand and damaged eye was documented as a training failure, an individual mistake, a human error in the operation of a flawless machine. But Maggie Harmon, had she been alive to read that report, would have known the truth. The fault did not lie with Everett Tully. The fault lay with a manufacturing limitation from 1920 that she and her father had accepted as a necessary compromise over 80 years earlier. A compromise that the Army had refused to fix because the weapon worked. A compromise that had been waiting patiently across 9 decades and 7 wars for a 19-year-old soldier in the dark to skip one step. The fix, when it finally came, was almost insultingly simple. In 2010, the United States Army introduced the M2A1, the first major modification to the M2 Browning since Maggie Harmon had finalized the heavy barrel design in the late 1920s. The change addressed exactly one problem: headspace and timing were now factory set permanently into each barrel assembly. Fixed. Machined to tolerance at the point of manufacture. No gauge required. No click counting. No field adjustment. To change a barrel on the M2A1, the gunner simply retracted the charging handle, slightly rotated the barrel using its carrying handle, and slid it out. The new barrel went in, locked into its J slot, and the weapon was ready to fire. The entire procedure took seconds. It could be done in the dark under fire by a stressed young soldier with burned hands, and it would work perfectly every time. The technology to do this had existed for decades. Precision CNC machining could hold tolerances that Edward Harmon's 1920s equipment could not have dreamed of. The fix could have been implemented in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s. It was not, because the weapon worked, because the training manuals covered the procedure, because the fault when barrels were improperly set was always attributed to the operator, because no one wanted to spend the money to fix a flaw in a weapon that had been winning wars for 80 years. The M2A1 was the first acknowledgement, quiet, bureaucratic, buried in a procurement document, that Maggie Harmon had been right all along, that the flaw she had inherited from her father, the flaw she had flagged in report after report, the flaw the Army had dismissed as theoretical for 9 decades, had been real, had been dangerous, had been hurting people. Other than the barrel fix, the M2A1 was identical to the M2HB. The weapon that Maggie Harmon had completed in the late 1920s was still in 2010 so well designed that the only thing anyone could find to improve was the one thing she had always said needed improving. There was one other change, though. It came not to the weapon itself, but to the way it was operated. The problem of the exposed gunner. The soldier standing up through the Humvee roof hatch, the most visible and vulnerable person in any convoy, had persisted from the Sherman tanks of World War II through every conflict since. For 80 years, the price of wielding the most powerful weapon in the column was painting a target on your own chest, the common remotely operated weapon station. Crows finally severed that bargain. The M2 was mounted on a motorized platform on the vehicle's roof. The gunner sat inside the armored hull, operating the weapon through a joystick and a video screen equipped with day and night cameras, a laser rangefinder, and computerized fire control. He could see farther, aim more precisely, and fire more effectively than any gunner who had ever stood behind the weapon in the open air. And he could do it without exposing a single square inch of his body to the enemy. The weapon on top of the Humvee was still the M2 Browning, 84 pounds of steel and purpose. The same short recoil cycle, the same disintegrating link belt, the same .50 BMG cartridge screaming downrange at 2,900 feet per second. But the young man behind it was now invisible, protected. Alive in a way that his grandfather standing in the open hatches of Shermans on the roads to Berlin and Tokyo had never been. Maggie would have approved of that if she had lived to see it. She had never stopped thinking about the soldiers at both ends of her weapon, the ones pulling the trigger and the ones standing in front of it. She could not do anything about the ones in front. That was the nature of what she had built. But the ones behind it, the gunners, the crews, the young men in the dark, those were her responsibility. They always had been. Margaret Harmon died in the autumn of 1983 in the workshop in Connecticut, where she had spent 57 years perfecting her father's creation. She was 85 years old. She had outlived Edward Harmon by 57 years, Braddock Llewellyn by 12, and every engineer who had told her a woman had no place in weapons development by at least a decade. She had never married. She had no children. She had the M2. The obituary in the Hartford Courant was 4 lines long. It mentioned her father. It did not mention the weapon. There is a weapon in a military museum that carries the serial number 324. It is the 324th M2 Browning ever manufactured. It was built in the early 1930s when fewer than 1,000 of these weapons existed and no one knew what to do with them. It was removed from active service in 2015. 94 years. That weapon served longer than most nations have existed in their current form. It fired in anger on battlefields that its creators could not have located on a map. It was operated by soldiers whose grandparents had not yet been born when it was assembled. It was maintained, repaired, rebarreled, and returned to service across a span of time that saw the invention of jet aircraft nuclear weapons, satellite communications, and the internet. And when it was finally retired, it was not because it had failed or become obsolete. It was retired because 94 years was enough for any single piece of steel to give. Today, the M2 Browning is in service with over 100 countries. It is manufactured by dozens of companies on 4 continents. It fires the same cartridge, operates on the same principle, and uses essentially the same design that Edward Harmon conceived in 1917 and Margaret Harmon completed in the late 1920s. More than a century of weapons development, guided missiles, directed energy weapons, autonomous drones, has not produced a replacement. Not because no one has tried, because no one has succeeded. The weapon is by any reasonable measure immortal. It has outlived its creator. His daughter, every soldier who ever fired it in the Second World War, and most of the nations it was designed to defend against. It will almost certainly outlive everyone reading these words. And somewhere in the steel of every M2 ever made in the receiver, that Maggie redesigned for universal mounting, in the heavy barrel she specified to solve the overheating problem in the feed mechanism she refined for ambidextrous operation. There is the ghost of a workshop in Connecticut, a drafting table covered in blueprints, a framed photograph of a man who died before his work was finished, and a woman who finished it not because anyone asked her to or believed she could, but because she understood something about the weapon that no one else alive understood. that it was not yet what it was supposed to be. She made it what it was supposed to be. And then it became something more. Something that exceeded every expectation, fulfilled every requirement, survived every war, and carried within its perfect design one small flaw that took 80 years to fix. A flaw that was not a failure of engineering, but a limitation of time. A reminder that even the greatest creations carry the fingerprints of the era that made them. Edward Harmon dreamed the M2 into existence. Margaret Harmon built it into reality. And reality, it turned out, was not big enough to contain what they had made. The Iron Lady still stands. She always will.